Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this virtual conversation on Sigrid Undset and Willa Cather, A Literary Friendship. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm a professor of philosophy and humanities at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island, where I help direct the Providence College Humanities program, and I'm the moderator for our discussion. This event's an initiative of the Institute for Human Ecology of the Catholic University of America. The Institute for Human Ecology is a community of advanced study, liberal learning, dedicated to the scientific understanding of man as the center and crown of nature, made in the image of God, whose interior qualities outstrip the sum of mere things. Taking wisdom, humility, and charity for her patron virtues, the Institute strives to foster open dialogue, intellectual friendship, and moral clarity, where the human person deserves to be preserved and human society deserves to be renewed. In a moment, I'll introduce our guest and we'll begin our conversation on tonight's theme. After about 45 minutes, we'll turn our attention to questions from our audience for our remaining 15 minutes. Those listening should feel free to submit questions for us at any point during our conversation using the comment function. We'll review them during the question portion and discuss as many of them as we have time for. And I apologize in advance if we aren't able to get to everyone's questions. It's now my pleasure to introduce our guest, Dr. Amy Fahey. Dr. Fahey is a teaching fellow at the Thomas More College of the Liberal Arts in Merrimack, New Hampshire, where she directs the Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture, public outreach of the college. She's an Inklings Project Fellow of the McGrath Institute for Religion and Public Life at Notre Dame University, and is currently editing an edition of William Morris's translation of the Icelandic sagas and a volume of essays on the influence of the Eddas and sagas on Christian writers. She's a frequent writer and speaker on literature and Christianity, including the work of the authors we're considering tonight, Sigrid Undset and Willa Cather. Amy, it's great to be with you this evening. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you.
To get us started, Amy, maybe you could say a little bit about the lives of Sigrid Undset and Willa Cather, how their friendship came about, and how you became interested in them.
So the chronology of my being interested in them, it doesn't align necessarily with the chronology of their friendship, but they, Willa Cather is 9 years Sigrid Undset's senior. So she was born in 1873. Sigrid Undset was born in 1882. And I would say that their most prolific periods as writers do overlap, sort of the 1920s, the early 1930s, that saw all of the great and notable writers, novels of these two writers, culminating in Sigrid Undset's Nobel Prize for her work on Kristin Lavransdatter and her earlier novels in 1928, and Willa Cather's Pulitzer Prize for One of Ours, a novel that I think we've discussed before. Their friendship, however, is of a much later date, even though their physical friendship, even though it starts much sooner. So their correspondence, and they know of each other in the 1920s and the 1930s. There are many comparisons being made between their works by critics. Their works are not works that are they're not consciously influencing each other. So I would say they're more affinities that we see in the works, and though they recognize those affinities early on. So in the 1920s and early 30s, we see comparisons being made between them. Also, so I'll just read very briefly from a letter of 1932, a New York Times column. It's actually on the 50th birthday of Sigrid Undset. Sigrid Undset will be 50 years old today, and the anniversary will be elaborately celebrated in Norway. Today, Alfred Knopf will bring out the new work under the title The Master of Hesvigen in a 2-volume edition. It continues to say that Sigrid Undset is seldom interviewed and never lectures. Of course, that was to change radically in the space of a decade. Her favorite American authors are Willa Cather and Ruth Sacco, and she keeps a photograph of Miss Cather on her writing desk. So as early as the 1932, she recognizes Cather as an influence. In another New York Times piece in 1937, when The Unfaithful Wife comes out, and there's a review of it, the reviewer says in its unaffected truthfulness and its serene, detached, almost grave intensity, her manner is nearer to Willa Cather's than to any other contemporary American. So flash forward to 1946, after the war. Sigrid Undset writes to Willa Cather from her home, Björkeback in Lillehammer, which had been being used as a brothel by the Nazis throughout the war. The desk her father made her burned for firewood. She writes, "Your picture, which Alfred Knopf sent me from you years ago, I also unearthed from the attic, where my roomers had put away pell-mell the things they did not want, which was not much. It is a little broken and soiled, but all the more dear to me." So Sigrid Undset was older, slightly older than I am, when she finally met through the agency of their mutual publisher, Alfred Knopf. So Knopf was Undset's American publisher, and there were earlier signs of correspondence. The only Willa Cather novel published in Sigrid Undset's lifetime, in Willa Cather's lifetime, was her penultimate novel, Lucy Gayheart. So Lucy Gayheart, and then her final novel, Sapphira and the Slave Girl. Lucy Gayheart, she had several novels published in Swedish. Of course, she has many Swedish protagonists in her novels. She had one or two novels published in Danish, but the only one published in Norwegian during Willa Cather's lifetime was Lucy Gayheart, which was translated by Sigrid Undset's younger sister, Signe Undset Thomas. And it was published by Sigrid Undset's publisher, Ashhog, at the request and the persistence of Undset herself. And so there was a kind of publishing connection between the two. If you know anything about Alfred Knopf himself, he was a great man for detecting talent and for putting the right people together. So he's the one who first arranged the meeting of these two writers. When Sigrid Undset, when the Nazis invaded Norway and Sigrid Undset had to make her long journey across the globe and ended up in Brooklyn, New York at the Hotel Margaret, where she lived and wrote as a propagandist for almost 5 years. During those 5 years, we don't have a lot of correspondence between the two women. We have some. It's very affectionate. I know you've looked at some of those letters on the Willa Cather archives, but they have a mutual affinity that they both recognize that is a great consolation to both of them. Sigrid Undset is 58 and Willa Cather is 67 when they meet. And they've both completed all of their major works in their fiction writing. So theirs is a seasoned friendship, and the things that they share in common are numerous, but perhaps we can go into that a little bit more. But that in brief is, during their time, at that time, Willa Cather was living on Park Avenue in New York. And so there was frequent opportunities for fellowship. A later article published again in the New York Times in 1948 says of Cather, "To most of her New York acquaintances, she was a fascinating enigma, especially during her moody later years. Now and then she would be seen at concerts or theater, and now and then she would entertain a few guests, such as Sigrid Undset." So clearly, they were both not women who entered friendship very readily. They were both very guarded women, very private women, made a great distinction between their writing life and their private life. And, yet they found this kinship together. That's a very beautiful friendship. And I think it speaks a lot of their personal affinities, not only in their later years, but in their fiction as well.
That their parallel lives, in some sense, quite remarkable in so many ways. I could you maybe say, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts about some of the ways the themes of their writing are parallel too, in some really deep ways. Their love of beauty, of the natural world, their real connection. I think both of them have they're kind of national writers in a sense. Sigrid Undset represents Norway in some deep ways and had a deep affection for its past and its culture. And Willa Cather too is a kind of American writer writing in the late 19th, early 20th century. Quite remarkable parallels thematically too. And how would we, or how should we think about them as writers who have similar interests as well as similar lives?
Yes, they definitely have similar interests and similar lives. I would say one similarity, unfortunate similarity of their later years, is they're both beginning to be rejected by the literary intelligentsia for flaws that are seen either in their writing or in their lives. And so you have critics calling Sigrid Undset immoral in the sense that D.H. Lawrence uses it for her conversion to Catholicism and for her so-called insertion of Catholicism in her writings. And you have people attacking Willa Cather for her so-called nostalgia, for her kind of abandonment, actually, of America in favor of the old world. And that sort of comes through a little bit in those beautiful, her most Catholic novels. I mean, you've probably met people, as I have, who, when you talk to them about Willa Cather, are shocked to hear that she herself was not Catholic, especially after reading Death Comes for the Archbishop and Shadows on the Rock, which are novels that show a great depth of appreciation for the ideals and values of Catholic Europe. So I think both of them seek a kind of, I don't want to say a refuge, but a kind of compass mark in the past, and in the past when there was a more firm belief in something beyond the unencumbered self. That's not to say that both of them don't, especially early on, prize protagonists, particularly heroines, who have a kind of break the mold attitude, who have a kind of inner vitality that isn't finding any, what Eliot would call objective correlative, in the outside world, in the world of the 1910s and the 1920s. Willa Cather had collected a lot of her miscellaneous writings in a work called Not Under 40. And that work was published relatively early on, but the title was intended to scare away people who were not under 40, because, as she said in the preface, the world broke in half in 1922 or thereabouts. And so both women, in the face of this fragmentation that they saw in culture around them, sought refuge in, you could say, in art and in beauty, certainly in nature, and in faith. And it's not accidental that when Willa Cather writes this in 1922 is the year that she is confirmed in the Episcopalian Church along with her parents. And that shortly thereafter, Sigrid Undset enters, both as mature adults, Sigrid Undset enters the Catholic Church.
When you said not under 40, they're both in their 40s when they convert as well. Maybe you just did 40, that's the age. You got to enter that age before you can be a serious person. It's quite something. So coming back just a second to the trajectory of their lives, both, and I thought that was so interesting. You say that their they face a kind of rejection from their profession, let's say, and maybe even in certain respects from their countries towards the end of their lives. And, both of them, their final novels or final pieces of writing, Sigrid Undset, her biography of Catherine of Siena, which is quite powerful, published posthumously, and people were a little unsure about it as a piece of writing and whether or not it measured up, let's say, to her earlier works. And then this unfinished novel by Willa Cather, Hard Punishments, which also goes even further back into the past. And they both end up in this place, one writing about Catherine of Siena, one writing a fictional story, where the Middle Ages are the inspiration of their imagination in a really deep way. And how should we think about, like, what is it about the Middle Ages that feels so compelling to them as writers?
Yeah, those are both very, we don't know, obviously, the vast majority of Hard Punishments, unfortunately. That was a work that Cather was laboring over for a number of years. And when she died, she asked Edith Lewis to burn the manuscript. And so it wasn't until maybe 20 years ago that some fragments of it were found among Cather's nephew's papers. And then Edith Lewis did a brief sketch of it after Willa Cather's death to kind of give us an idea of what the novel was about. Whereas obviously the biography of Catherine of Siena, I think what Doubleday wanted, she had a contract with Doubleday, and actually Doubleday rejected it, and it became the subject of a lawsuit after her death brought by her son Hans and the executors of her estate, because she never received that advance. And Doubleday admitted, look, we rejected it because it was written in Norwegian, then it was translated into English. There were certain inelegancies in the English, but the main reason was it was just too Catholic. And that would have been a detriment to her reputation and not a fitting final work. Interestingly, you'll be interested to know this because I know you've written about this particular episode in the biography of Catherine of Siena, that when she's at the hospital and she's caring for the woman with the bed sores and she drinks the liquid, they brought that forward as a bridge too far for our readers. No one will be able to handle that. So we cannot publish that. I find it really lovely that Alfred Knopf, when he was confronted about this after Sigrid Undset's death, said, I don't know why she didn't just come to me. We would have published it. We would have published anything by her. So she ended up, of course, publishing the Norwegian edition. And then I think it was 1951. She died in 1949. And the edition came out in Norwegian in 1951. And then Sheed and Ward, the British Catholic publisher, published it in 1954. And then Ignatius has recently brought it out in a publication. But I think in Undset's case, Catherine of Siena is almost a kind of anti-Christian or a kind of counterpoint to Christian. Not that Undset herself would have been anti-Christian, but
Kristin Lavransdatter. Yeah.
When Kristin Lavransdatter says early, when the narrator says she could not give up her inheritance of youth and beauty, that's exactly what Catherine of Siena does. And so she devotes herself to something higher from a very early age. And there's something very attractive. Of course, Undset herself was a Dominican tertiary. And so she had an affinity for the work that Catherine did, for her boldness in confronting error in her time. And then Hard Punishments revolves around certain corporal punishments for sin that two boys accused of blasphemy have to undergo. One gets a hand cut off and the other has his tongue cut out. And so you have these boys who are wounded by very stringent moral laws. And yet the passages that we have must be from the close of the novel. They take place in Toulouse, and there's a priest who's reflecting on his interaction with these boys who are now grown men, and there's just a real sense of the transcendent and the capacity of the liturgy. It's a Christmas liturgy to give a meaning and a context to the suffering that these boys have endured. So I think that there's both of these women undergo profound suffering, profound loss in their later years, in their final years. And they don't see, as do many others, but they don't see in their respective worlds any mechanism for making sense of that. Any kind of meaningful use of that suffering. Nothing learned by it in both of their views when they look out at the world. And they're both very clear on that in their writings, in their essays, and in their letters. There's a kind of, the New York Times columnist called it moodiness, but there's a kind of bitterness, a kind of frustration, and looking toward something beyond that can serve as a guide and give some meaning to the events that they've experienced. You see that all over Catherine of Siena.
Yes.
She's making contemporary parallels with war and really kind of drawing those connections between what everyone's experiencing in her own day.
I mean, I know, at least in my own case, when I'm reading, let's think about Sigrid Undset here for a second. Up until Kristin Lavransdatter, so she has a bunch of modern novels, Jenny, for example, Martha Uli, which is very early. But then there's also some medieval ones, Gunner's Daughter, for example. And she has a bunch of short stories. I see suffering as a real sort of central theme for her. She's always working over it. She has characters. So this character in Jenny, who's this older man who kind of seduces her, and he proposes to her that all suffering is it's just a means of growing into something better. It's like a lesson that we take. And she's completely unsatisfied with that. But then with Kristin Lavransdatter, something changes, at least in my experience of her writing. And from then on, suffering becomes something, well, I suppose on the deepest level, it becomes a way of identifying with Christ. It becomes something transformative, even redemptive. And then that sort of appears in all kinds of different ways in all the later stories. And Willa Cather, I don't feel it quite as dramatically, but something similar is still happening in there. There's something about, I think the professor's house at the end, the main characters, there's almost a bit of a resignation is not quite right, because I think they both kind of reject the old stoic, well, you just sort of stand up to the suffering and bear it, and that's just what you have to deal with. No, they have a deeper sort of appreciation of suffering as something, something redemptive, to use that Christian word. And I think Willa Cather, it's very similar. There's something, and it's kind of around their conversion years, when that's happening. Professor's House is right after Lost Ladies, Cather's first book after her confirmation, and then the Professor's House, and then you get Death Comes for the Archbishop, Shadows on the Rock. It's really powerful. So I think, maybe I'd love to hear what you think about the way their faith is so central to their writing. And maybe, Willa Cather never takes that final step to Catholicism, but she seems awfully close. Her sympathies seem very deep.
Yeah, I would say sympathy is the operative word there. I mean, she has or admiration, because admiration puts her at even a little bit more of a distance in terms of her, uh, you know, not being able to cross, to kind of travel so far, and to have there's when I read those passages in Death Comes for the Archbishop or Shadows on the Rock or any of her fictional writings that deal with faith, there's a kind of sadness for me because there's sort of such a deep appreciation for it, without a kind of participation in it. And so she has kind of, cuts herself off from some of that. There's a great, when she's talking about Shadows on the Rock with Governor Cross, I can't remember, I think it's Wilbur Cross, he's the governor of Ohio, who was also the Yale Sterling Professor of Literature. And she says, to me, the Rock of Quebec is not only a stronghold on which strange figures have for a time cast a shadow in the sun, it is the curious endurance of a kind of culture, narrow but definite. There, among the country people and the nuns, I caught something new to me, a kind of feeling about life and human fate that I could not accept wholly, but which I could not but admire. It is hard to state that feeling in language. It was more like an old song, incomplete and uncorrupted, than like a legend. And so she, she continually, she's very upset at one point when there's a literary anthology that mistakenly identifies her as Catholic. And she has a sort of, kind of retort about, she says the church, I admire and reverence the Roman Church as a great organization and a great spiritual power, certainly the greatest spiritual power this world has ever known. But someone can't understand how a person like this should not be herself a Catholic. The answer is very simple. I am an Episcopalian because my mother and father were, and that church is home to me. That obviously is not a very satisfying answer, especially for someone who has immersed herself in the history of Quebec, in the history of the Southwest, and later, in medieval history. So, and someone who has such a deep affinity with someone like Sigrid Undset, and a deep understanding and appreciation for all that Catholicism has done in this country. She talks admirably in her letters about nuns she has met, and people of faith that she has known. So there's clearly deep impediments for her to making that leap. Does not prevent her from having profound sympathy. I mean, her, both, I think maybe not Death Comes for the Archbishop, but Shadows on the Rock was early on. So the Catholic Book of the Month Club started in late in 1928. And I think the very next year, even before a novel of Sigrid Undset was on there, her Shadows on the Rock was listed as a Catholic Book of the Month. And so she was heralded as someone who was deeply sensitive to, knowledgeable of, and sympathetic with Catholic faith. I mean, the passages about the Blessed Mother in Death Comes for the Archbishop, and Saint Anne and Shadows on the Rock. I mean, they're very moving for Catholics. And so I think we, those of us who are Catholic, owe her a great debt of gratitude. She said, she was kind of criticized again for writing that history of Bishop Lamy. And she said, I waited, over 15 years for a Catholic to write it, and nobody did. So I was so enchanted by this story, and so in such awe and admiration of these men who were bringing faith and everything that goes along with faith. So she was very much in admiration of people who brought a kind of culture in the fullest sense of the word, to places that were kind of um, rude or harsh. The harshness of the landscape in Quebec, of that rock, the harshness of that the Acoma and the pueblos in Shadows on the Rock, and even the harshness of central Nebraska when Antonia and others come in and settle it, and so in the same way that she admires Antonia for bringing order and a kind of culture to Red Cloud, Nebraska, or Black Hawk, or wherever the fictional location is, she has tremendous admiration. And that goes back to her love of Virgil. Virgil at the very beginning of the Aeneid, he says, and they brought their gods with them out of Latium. And so she knew the central aspect of culture is to bring your gods with you. And I don't think it's accidental that all of these are Catholic, in their instantiation. I think she, eventually connected the dots, but still.
I do, the one, she gives one scene of Rome at the beginning of Death Comes for the Archbishop. I think it's just the beginning, those few pages. Yeah. And there you're like, oh, okay, so there's a little, decadent Rome. It's there, nice food and wine and good art. And then you're discussing, okay, you're going to send this archbishop out to the Southwest where he, he'll live a difficult, challenging life, a life of a missionary. And there it's like, oh, okay, I can see a little bit, that's a good English, nice British critique of Catholicism. We'll have Mary and all the sacramentality, but we'll be a little cautious about Rome.
Also there, talk about her early. I mean, both of them, both Undset and Cather, are, they have these early passionate declarations about art and the writer, right? This letter that famous letter that Willa Cather writes to Marielle Gear in 1896. There is no God but one God, and art is his revealer. That's my creed, and I'll follow it to the end. And then Sigrid Undset declaring to her pen pal Dee in 1902, it's an artist I want to be, a woman artist, not a pen-wielding lady. But the interesting thing to me, now that you mentioned that opening scene, is if you recall, the reason the cardinal is so intent on sending them there is not conversion. He wants to find the lost El Greco.
The lost painting. Yes, it's too great.
So she clearly has a kind of, she's developed a scorn for those who are, the kind of art connoisseurs without recognizing why do we want a lost El Greco of St. Francis?
So both of them, they somehow, maybe we'll see what you think about this. I find that as they kind of transition from, shall we say, kind of art as what's saving about human life, what gives it its deepest meaning, they sort of move into faith. And then art's not left behind. It's sort of brought along and even deepened. We're sticking with Death Comes for the Archbishop for a second. That he builds the cathedral at the end. Yes. And it's simple, it's Romanesque, but it's good stone. It's well constructed. He has the architect come over from France to do a nice job on it. And I see that as a statement that actually, no, art is purified, elevated within faith. And you lose some of the dangers of decadence once it's put in its proper place, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think of that moment at the beginning with Brother Edwin and Kristin Lavransdatter, where Kristin is in the cathedral and she experiences a kind of transfiguration, right? So the light from the stained glass is shining on her. So she's receiving this light from Christ. And there's something incredibly beautiful and transcendent about the capacity of art to draw you upward, and not simply to heavy focus on the thing itself. And
Yeah.
and I think that's
Yeah.
what she thought of her writing as well. That's what both of them thought of their writing. I was thinking right at the beginning, I don't know that I'll be able to find my copy of My Antonia, but at the very beginning of My Antonia, you have Jim Burden, and he and the narrator, who's kind of a Willa Cather figure, right, are talking about what it was like to grow up in the plains. The dust and the heat, the burning wind reminded us of many things. We were talking about what it is like to spend one's childhood in little towns like these, buried in wheat and corn under stimulating extremes of climate, burning summers when the world lies green and billowy beneath a brilliant sky, when one is fairly stifled in vegetation, in the color and smell of strong weeds and heavy harvests, blustery winters with little snow when the whole country is stripped bare and gray as sheet iron. We agreed that no one who has not grown up in a little prairie town could know anything about it.
Mm.
So there's a kind of deep irony there because the description is so synesthetic, we feel like we're there. So the capacity of art to draw us toward reality when we're living in an age where the kind of experience and the contact with reality is receding. I think both Undset and Cather recognize that, and they're, Cather did not like being told she had a painterly eye or that she was very good at descriptive passages, because to her, it wasn't about the artistry. If you were just focusing on, oh, that was just a wonderful little bit of description, you were missing the point. And I think the same is true of Sigrid Undset. One critic said, oh, she's like a meteorologist in her novel. She's always giving us the weather. And that's totally missing the point. I mean, in Kristin Lavransdatter, the way she talks about the natural world and storms and snow and floods is to allow us to see something about the psychological, the inner drama that's going on. There's that stalemate between Kristin and Lavrans. And when he relents and they go outside and the rains come, it's just so beautiful. But there's that kind of integration that both authors, I think, were hoping the reader would pick up on.
That's beautiful. Yeah. I love, I often point out to people that, at least this is from Kristin Lavransdatter, but Undset describes their clothing so carefully. You can just imagine their elaborate, medieval 14th century clothing, because they're all aristocrats, or many of them aristocrats in that novel. And it's very beautifully, well, you said not to say painterly, but it's beautifully painted. And it's a pleasure to read. Well, now we've got just a few minutes before our discussion period, and I thought maybe I'd love for you to tell us sort of what's your favorite novel from Willa Cather, and what's your favorite from Sigrid Undset, and why are those the ones who rise to the top for you?
Well, that's very difficult, Ray. But with Sigrid Undset, it's definitely Kristin Lavransdatter, because that's the novel I first read of hers. It's the novel I have the deepest affection for, that I've returned to again and again at different phases. I first read it when I was a young mother, and I was in bed with a fever with mastitis. And so, which is an infection from nursing. And so if you know anything about the novel, you know that there's something kind of strangely appropriate about that. But my background as a scholar is in medieval literature, and I had never encountered this novel before. And I just had this wonderful experience of affinity, like Cather and Undset had in their own friendship. And I wanted to know everything about the author, and I wanted to read everything that she read, because I could see echoes of Hildegard of Bingen and of the Canterbury Tales, you know, the prioress when she goes to the convent. I could see echoes of The Dream of the Rood. I could see so many medieval works and layers of all that in the work, and it was so beautiful. And then with Willa Cather, it's My Antonia. And I think I mentioned to you that I really like that novel. I mean, I have tremendous affection for Shadows on the Rock and Death Comes for the Archbishop, but just in terms of what that novel elicits for me, and it's you know, as a work of art that transcends those categories, it's my favorite. So
I think I agree with you for Sigrid Undset. I think I like Kristin Lavransdatter the best. Although I tell people, I don't know what you think about this, but I tell people that the last 50 pages of Olav Audenson, or sometimes called The Master of Hestviken, I think those are the most emotionally powerful pages she ever wrote, actually. I think Kristin Lavransdatter is a better book, but those last 50 pages are unimaginably amazing. Those of you in the audience who haven't read The Master of Hestviken or Olav Audenson, I really, if you love Kristin, you should read that one too. It's quite
and Olav Audenson is kind of rising for me. So, but we'll see.
Yeah, I feel like I haven't quite cracked the code for Olav Audenson. I love for Kristin, it's so important to me those books that are important from her, that she inherits from her mother-in-law. She inherits a book of the Psalms and a book of the Lives of the Saints and a book of the story of Tristan and Isolde, the story of adultery and forbidden love, and which is so important to her. And I see those kind of woven through, and I haven't found a center of gravity like that yet for Olav Audenson. Although there's lots of options, like the story of Simon of Cyrene, so important in that novel. That's really terrific. Well, we have just a couple minutes, and I think I'd love to hear just a little bit before we turn to our discussion. We've talked a little about their love of beauty, these two authors, their connection to Catholicism, to their countries, a little bit to the natural world. What do you think about their connection to the pagan world? Both of them have a deep kind of attachment or interest in the pre-Christian world, and it's not Europe. It's not materialism or something like that. It's something deep. We've got the Southwest for Willa Cather, the Old Norse paganism for Sigrid Undset, and it just seems to give them a deep energy to their writing.
Yeah,
and they're critical in some ways, but they have a deep appreciation and even affection, I think, for those things.
absolutely. And I could say a lot about Sigrid Undset in that regard, because that's something that has always interested me, and I've kind of made it a study more recently to look at why writers like Lewis and Tolkien and Undset are so enchanted with the pagan North, and what they see in it that actually draws them toward Christianity and not in a kind of repellent way, like, this is so awful, we've got to do something better. Obviously, they see that there's a kind of that the fatalism and the working out of the pagan faith puts the characters in a kind of bind from which they cannot escape without the aid of something outside of themselves. And so, you know, when Sigrid Undset says the new heathenism is how does she express it? The modern heathenism is a new thing, a declaration of war against a God who has spoken, where the old heathenism was a love song to a God who hid himself. And so I think she sees that. I mean, there obviously in Kristin, there's that tension between whenever things are going bad, you know, they revert to the old pagan ways because they think, oh, well, this is going to help us. But in kind of the same way, that drama, and I had a student who recently worked on Gunnar's Daughter who drew this out beautifully in that short saga-like novel. That drama is going on constantly in the human heart. between self-will and between adherence to something outside the self. And we see that struggle in young Sigrid Undset when she has these, again, grandiose declarations of, I did it my way. and you're always kind of thinking, let's see how that goes for you. And we know it's not going to go very well. And, she's allowed to follow her own Sigrid Undset herself, and many of her characters are allowed to follow their own self-will to its inevitable disastrous and destructive conclusion. And then, Christianity is, presented as not just, well, here's a nice, convenient way to get you out of this bind, but as a myth, as Lewis says, a myth that's actually true. And so the truth of Christ's sacrifice is just hits Undset so hard and so beautifully. I think with Cather, the attraction with the Southwest is a little bit different. And so when she first goes there, it's something so strange, so hostile. It seems so untouched by culture, by faith, by belief, and it's not part of her own past in the way that the Norse paganism is for Sigrid Undset, just in terms of place. But Cather wants to kind of know it. So she says, I traveled by horse or mule over all of those lands. I went to the Acoma Pueblo. I met with people who were descendants of the indigenous population. She wanted to understand and comprehend again what they lacked and what Bishop Lamy brought to them, and what they accepted and what they were not willing to accept, what they rejected, because all of that is present in Death Comes for the Archbishop.
So we're going to turn to some questions now from the audience. And though the most important question, Amy, is, does the elf maiden really appear to Kristen at the beginning of Kristen Lavardar? That is the most important question, because the horse
She absolutely
whinnies.
Does.
The horse
of course
whinnies,
she does.
so we know it appears.
Of course she does. And
okay.
Yeah. We can say more about the elf maiden. We got to go to questions.
Okay, so this is the first question, kind of a general one, but I think an important one thinking about reading Sigrid Undset. Let me read here. Could you say something about the translations of Undset and make some recommendations on translations of particular works? And were any of her works composed actually and published in English?
So she had some essays that were published in English. She published quite frequently for something called the St. Ansgar's Bulletin, which was the Scandinavian club in New York during her time there. She gave addresses regularly in English, commencement addresses, lectures. Happy Times in Norway, which was commissioned by Eleanor Roosevelt as part of a series to encourage people to see what these occupied countries were like and what they could be. There are other works that were originally written in English, but all of her fiction was written originally in Norwegian. And a very, I don't know Norwegian. I've tried to learn it, but jeg forstår ikke norsk. I don't really speak Norwegian, and I have Norwegian editions of many of the works, and I like to go and compare and do some digging into the language. But my understanding, and I had a brief conversation about this with Bishop Ergavarden Strandheim last May, is that her Norwegian is very difficult to translate. She was born in Denmark. She has a lot of Danish sort of worked in. And she also is both fair in the style of the saga, but also very lyrical in her descriptions. And so managing all of that, and I would add to that, just when I look at the novel, the sagas are full of proverbs. And she has many proverbs in work like Kristin Lavransdatter. And proverbs are, very, sometimes very culture specific and difficult to translate. Sometimes you only translate a proverb with another proverb. And so I've looked at many of the proverbs in Kristin Lavransdatter to see how they've been translated. I think I've written about the available translations, again from a period, a vantage point of relative ignorance of the original languages, but more about how they've impacted me on reading them and others. And so I don't say that the newer translation, the Tina Nunnally translation, has totally superseded the Charles Archer translation. Many people, myself included, their first introduction to the novel was through the Charles Archer translation. I don't know about you, Ray. Did you read?
True for me too. Yeah.
Yeah.
First, so I read Kristin Lavransdatter in college actually, and then didn't come back to Undset for quite a while.
Right.
And then ended up reading Tina Nunnally's translations, which I liked very much. But my first exposure was to the old 3-volume translation. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think so. I think you always kind of retain an affection because it does its work on you. I mean, you don't. I mean, it's more medieval-esque. So it's not, which is not something that Undset is doing in her original. The these and thous and methinks. But you kind of fall into a rhythm with that after a while, and it retains its power. I mean, that was the version that Dorothy Day read and impacted her so deeply, and many other writers. And in Sigrid Undset's own day, it was the authorized translation. Certain parts were cut out of it; those were restored in the newer translation. It's interesting because at one point, Willa Cather writes a letter to Sigrid Undset in which she says, and this is in the 40s, "I'm so glad that your Kristin Lavransdatter has been restored to a 3-volume set instead of that large unwieldy tome." and I actually, so the one woman who I'm in great debt to is a scholar named Cheryl Harbison, who is emerita now, but was a professor of Scandinavian languages and literature at UMass Amherst, and the only one that I've seen who's written with any thoroughness on the relationship between Sigrid Undset and Willa Cather. And she did really good introductions to the Penguin when they were 3 volumes. And when they combined them all, they cut those introductions out entirely, so they're very difficult to come by. I don't know if you have the 3-volume Tina Nunnally.
I have the new one,
the tome,
the 1 volume, the tome.
Yeah, and it's very attractive with the rose mawing on the front, and it's very good.
It is.
Little sticky notes in. And,
I mean, I do love having it all in one hand because so much of her writing is it's self-referential. So you've got these little memories of.
It's very contrapuntal. There's the themes that are kind of coming
back
up
on
again
page
and
100.
again.
Page 700. She's talking about page 100, and you can flip back and look at it.
That's right.
And I do. I mean, here I'm going out on a limb again, but I think she's as maybe more psychologically perceptive than Dostoevsky, and you see that partly in the way that you can remember the events and then look back on page. So anyway, so Penguin does me a favor.
So I'd say, if you haven't read Kristin Lavransdatter, just pick up whatever translation you have. I'm not gonna, stake my reputation on one or the other. Several of Clooney Press has brought out many of the editions. So the Master of Hespegan was originally translated not by Charles Archer, but by Arthur Chater, and he translated a lot of the early novels. And those are still available either from Ignatius Press or from Clooney Press. So the Catholic publishers have really been bringing out the older editions that are no longer in copyright of her novels.
Mm.
There are some that are, there's some works that are still untranslated. Tina Nunali did the translation of Jenny and of several letters. Um, and then there are essays that are translated in different works. But I would say, you know, it's more looking at what's available. It's not like there are multiple translations of anything but the major works, the Kristin Lavransdatter and
Yeah,
Olaf Audenson.
yeah. So here's a question, another question. Are there any contemporary authors whom you would recommend who draw from similar inspirations as these two authors? And
Ooh,
maybe I'll just add, maybe also are inspired by Willa Cather and Sigrid Undset herself.
yeah. I Golly. I mean, there's a contemporary of theirs, Olav Rolvang, who wrote a lengthy novel that I'm about to start called Giants of the Earth, that's set, I believe, in North Dakota. And he's sort of heralded as someone who draws on um, or intersects with both writers, but not really a contemporary writer. You know, I don't, I mean, there's the style of writing now is so different. I don't know that we have the patience for the kinds of writing both of those writers did. I mean, there's two writers and works that come to mind that have similar affinities for the scope of what they're writing and their intersections with faith. One is Leif Enger's Peace Like a River, and the other is Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. But again, I can't really think. I mean, obviously Wendell Berry is a little bit Cather-esque. Um, so,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I would welcome suggestion. Jane Smiley wrote there's a lot who do these kind of Viking continuations. George Mackay Brown is a more contemporary writer. I would definitely recommend, a Catholic Orcadian writer from the
Yeah.
Orkney Islands.
Yes, yeah. One of my students recently said Kristen Lavransdatter reminds her of George Martin's Game of Thrones. That well, maybe there's some loose family resemblances. All right, I can maybe see that. So I think we have time for just one more question. I apologize again to those of you for whom we weren't able to get to all your questions. There's really some great ones here. This is a question about coming back to Catholicism. What can we say about thinking about Cather and Willa Cather in particular, about non-Catholics writing about Catholic themes? It seems like Cather does it well, but then again, so do other Catholic writers. We might think of Undset herself, of course, but Evelyn Waugh, Walker Percy, who might even go deeper into a discussion of, say, grace.
Yeah, so I don't think you're going to get that. You know, Brideshead revisited the operations of grace on a certain set of people. That intentionality of drawing us toward grace, or you know, say Flannery O'Connor, you know, leaving us on the threshold of grace in her short stories. Willa Cather doesn't operate on that plane as you know, that's a huge difference between the two writers, I would say. She gives us a kind of appreciation, but there's a distance. I would posit, and that distance doesn't cancel out the sympathy for the faith, and in fact, I know some people say, you know, a writer like Lewis, you know, a lot of people like to say, well, because Lewis remained outside of the Catholic Church, he was actually able to draw more people toward it. It was more effective evangelist as a non-Catholic than a Catholic. I don't really like to think in those terms. I don't think that's extremely helpful. But I would say for a non-Catholic, Willa Cather has, through her fiction, opened up an understanding of the Catholic faith for Catholics and non-Catholics alike that I think is very beneficial. I'm under no I have no problem saying that someone who can go beyond what they think and what they're capable of. That act of being able to write those passages is, in my view, a kind of understanding of grace that's very mysterious. How is it that a non-Catholic writer can write so movingly and persuasively about the Blessed Mother? There is, and I think again, her interest in art accounts for some of that, because the movement of art and the viewing of so many beautiful cathedrals and paintings and listening to so much sacred music. She had a couple of core key experiences, when her brother died and she was so despondent and by herself and she just wanted to pray. The only place that was open was the Catholic Church. And so she herself had these key experiences that were very transcendent for her and very healing. And so her sympathy was punctured. I mean, that distance was punctured on many occasions, but I would say, I'm grateful that she's written the fiction that she has and left that record of others' faith for us.
Amy, that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for our time together this evening. It's been a real treat.
Thank you.
It just makes me want to read them more, I must say, much as I already have.
That was my objective.
They deserve it.
Thank you to Nate and to the IAT for organizing this. I hope there'll be a surge in sales of Sigrid Undset and Willa Cather.
So thank you all for being with us. It's really been a pleasure, and bless you all.
Thank you.